In this section, we're going to keep talking about stress, but now we're going to start talking about how stress affects our health. Hans Selye, the one who described general adaptation syndrome that we saw in the last section of this chapter, ended up inspiring a whole generation of medical and psychological research to try and explore the effects of stress on both our physical and psychological well-being. From what we had talked about in that previous section, we've seen that stress can cause both physical and psychological deterioration over time, and especially the longer things go on, the worse the effects we start to feel. So one of the predominant theories that we have right now is that the system that governs stress and how we respond to stress would have evolved for us to physically respond to physical stressors. So when humans were evolving, when we were, out in the wild, we would have been responding to physical stressors like being hunted by predators or having to find food, things like that. But that system isn't quite the same anymore. So we adapted for those physical stressors and having a physical response, but it might not be as useful in dealing with the psychological stressors that we're facing in modern lives. So we've evolved in an environment that's very different from the one we live in now. When considering this psychological side of things, we see the most dramatic effects of stress on those psychological factors of well-being in people who have experienced catastrophic life events. So catastrophic life events being things like floods, hurricanes, or fires. And after natural disasters, we can see up to a 17% increase in psychological disorders like depression and anxiety. Some individual stressors can be so traumatic that they'll end up having strong and long-lasting psychological impacts on the people that experience them. We see situations like people who've survived the Holocaust, veterans who were involved in armed combat, victims of terrorist attacks, or, as we mentioned, natural disasters, children who survived residential schools. There are all sorts of these events that have documented very strong and very long-lasting psychological effects on those who lived through them. And these effects can lead people to have changes in how they experience the world and change their behavior in response to things. So it ends up becoming something that influences their whole life. Now, not everyone ends up experiencing such traumatic and profound life events. Most people are going to end up having some negative life events, but not necessarily having all of their psychological impacts grounded on one major event. And in these cases where people have many smaller events, smaller negative life events, we see this pattern where people who have more negative life events end up reporting having more psychological distress. And you might conclude that more negative life events causes more psychological distress. But we have to do some critical thinking here. Remember back to chapter 2 and think about how we're getting this data. In order to conduct ethical research, you're not going to be causing people to have negative life events to determine the effect of increased negative life events. Instead, to get this data, you'd have to do a correlational study, a study where you measure how many negative life events someone has experienced over their life and how many or how much psychological distress they report. So you'd be doing a correlational study. And what you would find is that people who have more negative life events also report more psychological distress. So there's a correlation between the two, but we can't assume causation. And we can look at this diagram at the bottom to see why. And this will be, again, review from chapter 2. But we assume that this negative life event scores, so the more negative life events you have, the more psychological distress you're going to have. So the higher your psychological distress score. So you're going to be more likely to have depression or anxiety or any of those measures of psychological distress. And arrow 1 is showing us a directionality, a causality to this relationship, where more negative experiences leads to more psychological distress. But that's not the only thing that could be happening. If we look at arrow number 2 here, we're saying, well, maybe people who are more psychologically distressed happen to experience more life events. Maybe by being distressed, you're putting yourself in situations that have negative outcomes. Or maybe if you're more psychologically distressed, you're going to interpret things as negative events, even if they are neutral. So there could be this other directionality to that relationship. Or, as we talked about previously in the course, there could be a third factor. Maybe there's something that's driving both your negative life events and your levels of psychological distress. Something like neuroticism, which we'll talk about in just a moment. So a personality factor might be influencing how you interact with events in the world and how you feel about how distressed you are because of those. So this is just saying that because this is a correlational study, like to look at these things, it would have to be correlational. So we can't really determine causality. We can't know that more negative life events are causing increased distress. So keep that in mind. So if we want to talk about that potential third factor that I had just mentioned, neuroticism, we might recall that neuroticism is a personality trait where if you are high in neuroticism, you tend to be a little bit more high-strung, a little bit more anxious. So people with that high neuroticism score have an increased tendency to experience negative emotions. And they also seem to get themselves into stressful situations because they end up with maladaptive behavior. Again, probably related to their personality trait of being a little bit neurotic. So that's telling us here that, they might be interpreting events more negatively. They also might be putting themselves into situations where they have more of these negative life events. And because they're not coping well, they might be experiencing more psychological distress. So there is actually some evidence that neuroticism might be playing a role in at least some of this, where we have that link between negative life scores and our psychological distress. So all of this information gives us a little bit more confidence saying that it's probably not a straight causal relationship here. It is going to be more of this network of interrelated aspects where our stressors can have long-lasting psychological impacts, but having negative psychological impacts can lead us to report more psychological distress. More negative life events can lead to more psychological distress, but maybe the distress can lead to more negative life events. So it's all interactive, it's all complicated. So it's not as clean cut as we might like it to be. For this next slide here, we want to go back to talking about individuals who have experienced extreme stress or trauma. And so this is PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, PTSD is a really complex and multifaceted disorder, so we're going to stick to some very basic interpretations of it. But if this is something you're interested in looking into, there's lots of research on different types of PTSD caused by different types of events, just so you know it's out there. But in general, PTSD is going to be a serious or a severe anxiety disorder caused by exposure to some sort of traumatic life event. So you are exposed to some sort of very severe stress, and you may end up experiencing PTSD. So the 4 major symptoms that can occur with PTSD are here on the screen. So you can have severe anxiety, the psychological arousal, that stress response and distress. So people experiencing PTSD might constantly be on red alert. They're constantly looking for a threat. They're constantly ready to respond to some form of attack. So that high arousal state is basically their fight or flight system always being on. They also have issues with painful, uncontrollable reliving of the event or events in flashbacks, dreams, or fantasies. So these flashbacks can come in terms of sort of intrusive thoughts where something reminds you of the event and all of a sudden you experience a bunch of stimuli as though you were there again. So if you were attacked, this could lead to feeling like you're being attacked again. You could have yourself imagining what it was like in that situation. And as you can imagine, these intrusive thoughts and dreams and fantasies and things showing up in your mind unintended can cause you to re-experience the trauma of having gone through that event. So it's painful because it's going to cause you distress, and oftentimes it's uncontrollable. It's going to happen at odd times, sometimes triggered by other events, sometimes out of the blue. And so it's really hard to keep functioning when these things can pop up anytime, anywhere, and force you to relive that pain. The next symptom that might be experienced is emotional numbing and avoidance of stimuli associated with the trauma. So if people don't want to relive that event, if people want to try and separate themselves from a traumatic event that's causing them all of these symptoms, they might shut down all of their emotions. So they might choose not to feel anything because they don't want to feel that distress. So they might end up cutting out happiness. They might end up cutting out enjoyment because in their mind, feeling numb is better than feeling that distress again. And they might start avoiding different events that remind them of what happened. So things that might trigger these flashbacks or intrusive thoughts, they might start avoiding those areas. So if someone was attacked in a particular city or in a particular type of street, they might start avoiding that city or streets that look like that, or anything that even makes them think about that. And as time goes on, that avoidance can become sort of all-encompassing. They can start avoiding everything because pretty much anything starts reminding them of the event. And for our last symptom, individuals with PTSD can sometimes experience intense survival guilt. So this is especially prominent in individuals, say, who had gone to war, where they survived an event, but others didn't. And this can happen for terrorist attacks or natural disasters, but people start to feel guilty that they survived and others didn't. And they're going to start feeling bad that maybe they're not making more of themselves or that they're there at all. So all of these symptoms, as you can imagine, have really intense and sort of life-altering consequences because they infiltrate every level of living. And so if we want to talk about things that influence likelihood of experiencing PTSD, individuals are a lot more likely to develop PTSD if the source of their trauma was human-caused. So people would be a lot more likely to develop PTSD if they had suffered a traumatic event due to war or a personal attack or something involving people, and a little bit less likely to develop it in response to something natural. So a natural disaster would be less likely to cause PTSD than, say, having lived through a terrorist attack. There are sex differences in how likely individuals are to experience PTSD, where women are more likely than men to develop PTSD. And there are a bunch of other external factors and internal factors that can cause someone to be more predisposed towards PTSD or less predisposed. Things like pre-existing experiences. If you've already lived through traumatic events, then you might be more likely to experience PTSD for a new event because of having previous experience. If you have a really good support system, if you have a lot of people who are there for you, it can help mitigate some of the risks of developing PTSD. Individual coping strategies can make you more or less likely to develop PTSD, and even the presence of pre-existing psychological conditions can make you more or less likely. So there's lots of different factors that can be at play here. And the last of these factors is the severity of the event itself. Sufficiently traumatic events are going to end up causing PTSD most of the time, regardless of those mitigating factors, if they are severe enough. So there's lots of different things to keep in mind when determining if someone is going to end up developing PTSD or not. An important topic to discuss that's very closely related to PTSD and really relevant in the world right now is residential school syndrome. And so residential school syndrome has a lot of symptoms similar to PTSD, so it's a good time to bring it up here. But for those of you who aren't aware, I'll give a little bit of background about residential schools in Canada, because this is something that we should really know about. We should know our history. But between the 1870s and 1990s, so very, very recently, an estimated 150,000 Indigenous children were forced to attend residential schools across Canada. These schools were intended to try and strip away Indigenous identities and force children to assimilate to the identity of all of Canada. And while this was happening, children as young as 4 years old would be removed from their families, their communities, and cultures, and sent to live in those residential schools where they were isolated from what they had been born into, what they had been raised into. And they were forced to adopt cultures that weren't their own. In addition to the severe trauma of being separated from their families and loved ones, there were also reports of children who were psychologically, physically, and even sexually abused in these schools. For a significant number of individuals who were put through this, they ended up experiencing lasting problems, a lot of symptoms that end up mimicking or being equivalent to PTSD. So if we look at the list on the screen here, so individuals were experiencing things like recurrent intrusive memories, nightmares, and flashbacks, which lines up with these painful, uncontrollable reliving of events in flashbacks. A lot of this trauma led to increased risk of alcohol and drug abuse, starting at a very young age, potentially as a coping mechanism. When we talk about looking for ways to numb yourself emotionally to what you had gone through, that might be a coping mechanism. We also see emotional detachment and difficulty forming relationships because what they had lived through. And one of the most heartbreaking things was the loss of and avoidance of cultural knowledge. They had it drilled into their heads that their culture was wrong, that they shouldn't seek out their own heritage. And it changed them. And all of this conflict could lead to anger management problems because they didn't quite know how to vent or outlet the trauma that they had been put through. So this is a really real and important example of traumatic events causing long-term damage. And it's important to know that this happened. And if we want to start looking at other effects of stress, both long-term and things that lead to, say, PTSD, we see lots and lots of studies that show a link between stress and increases in different kinds of chronic conditions. So things like arthritis, bronchitis, emphysema. So if you think of that exhaustion phase where we've run out of resources because our body has been running under stressful conditions in the resistance phase for so long, we're running down our bodies. We have problems with other parts of our bodies now, so you end up with other kinds of problems. So this long-term exposure to stress can end up being a precursor to other health problems. And the more stressors that you're exposed to, the higher your risk of having health problems. So researchers have shown that things like stress from marital conflict can decrease your immune function. And having decreased immune function leaves you susceptible to illness and disease. So if your immune function is reduced, you're not able to fight off different pathogens. So you'd be more likely to get the flu, or you'd be more likely to come down with, even more severe things. And this decrease in immune function can end up occurring as quickly as within 24 hours of your stress response starting. So the longer you're stressed, the more compromised your immune system can be and the more at risk you are. It can also end up worsening pre-existing conditions because, again, you're using up resources that you don't really have. And this prolonged period of those stress hormones that our body is pumping can end up blocking arteries and causing problems downstream there. So things like issues with your heart and lungs because of blocked arteries and improper movement of blood. And in the long run, you can end up with deterioration of your hippocampus and you end up with memory impairment. So these are severe examples of what can happen, but there are lots of effects that stress can have on our bodies long term.